85 days. That's how long Nancy Guthrie has been missing. 85 days since an 84-year-old woman vanished from her own home. In her pajamas, without her medication, without her pacemaker signal, without a trace. 85 days of her family waking up every morning not knowing. And tonight, that changes, because what investigators have now uncovered doesn't just advance this case. It answers the question that has haunted everyone who has followed this story from the very beginning. But before we get there, before we talk about what was found, where it was found, and what it means, we have to stop. We have to go back to the beginning. Because this story is not about evidence. It is not about timelines or cell towers or DNA. It is about a woman named Nancy Guthrie. She was 84 years old. She had lived in the same Tucson neighborhood for decades. She had a routine that her neighbors could set their watches by. Church on Sundays, quiet evenings at home, medication every morning without fail. She had children who loved her, grandchildren who called her, a life that was simple and full and completely hers. She relied on a pacemaker to keep her heart beating steadily. She had doctors she trusted. She had a calendar with appointments she intended to keep. On February 3rd, she had a meeting scheduled with her attorney. She never made it. Because on the night of February 1st, something happened inside her home that no one who loves her will ever fully recover from. And the last person to see her alive was someone she trusted completely. Let's go back to that night, to the facts, not the rumors, not the speculation, the facts. Nancy had spent the evening at her daughter Annie's home, a routine visit, dinner, conversation, a few hours together that by all accounts felt completely normal. No tension, no arguments, nothing that would have made anyone in that room look at their watches and worry. At some point that evening, Tommaso Cioni, Nancy's son-in-law, drove her home. That part is not disputed. He pulled into the driveway of her home in the Catalina foothills. He waited. He watched her walk inside. He saw the garage door close behind her. And then he left. That moment, Nancy walking through that door, is the last confirmed visual of her alive. Everything that happened after that exists in a window of darkness that investigators have spent 85 days trying to illuminate. The first thing that told investigators something was deeply wrong was not something they saw, it was something they didn't. No forced entry, no broken glass, no shattered lock, no sign of a struggle at the threshold. Whoever entered that home that night, they didn't break in. They walked in, because they knew how. At 1:47 a.m., Nancy's doorbell camera went offline. Not a glitch, not a power failure. The system was accessed remotely using the correct credentials, the correct password, entered by someone who didn't guess it, someone who knew it. And at 2:28 a.m., 41 minutes later, Nancy's pacemaker transmitted its last signal. 41 minutes. That window, 1:47 to 2:28, is where everything happened. And what investigators found inside that window is what broke this case open. Here is what the timeline tells us. Pacemakers are not passive devices. They do not simply monitor, they record every rhythm shift, every cardiac event, every moment of distress, logged, time-stamped, transmitted. And what Nancy's pacemaker recorded in those 41 minutes paints a picture that no one who loves her should have to imagine. Rapid physical motion, cardiac distress, and then, at 2:28 a.m., silence. Not a gradual fade, not a battery failure, silence. The kind of silence that only happens one way. Now here is what the investigation found that the public did not know. The supervisor who first responded to Nancy Guthrie's home had never investigated a homicide before. Let that sit for a moment. An 84-year-old woman. A pacemaker that went silent at 2:28 in the morning, blood on the porch, a door propped open. And the person responsible for preserving that scene, the most critical moments of the entire investigation, had never stood inside a homicide scene before. One investigator who reviewed the case asked a question that cuts through everything. Were you interested in preserving her life at all? We know there was blood on the porch. We know the door was propped open. We know she separated from her pacemaker at approximately 2:28 in the morning, and we know that whoever took her deliberately chose not to take the medication she needed to survive. That was not an oversight. That was a decision. While search teams moved through desert terrain and helicopters scanned open land, while Nancy's family stood in front of cameras with trembling voices asking strangers to help find their mother, Tommaso Cioni said nothing, not publicly. Not emotionally, not even in the way people expect when someone they love disappears. He said nothing. And in missing person investigations, behavior matters. The absence of something can speak just as loudly as the presence of it. And his silence stood apart from everyone else connected to Nancy Guthrie in a way that investigators could not dismiss. But there was something else, something that moved this case from a missing person investigation into something far more disturbing. January 11th, 3 weeks before Nancy disappeared, a masked individual appeared at her front door. Not forcing entry, not attempting to break in, just present. Experienced investigators described that appearance with one specific word: a test. Because in planned operations, you do not begin with the event. You begin with observation. You study the environment. You study the timing. You learn what happens when you do something small. You see who notices. You see what the response is. You identify the gaps. And then you use them. January 11th was a test. January 24th, another date investigators flagged. Not publicly explained, but important enough for Nancy's own family to ask the public to focus on it specifically, to check their cameras, to revisit their memories from that day. When a family asks that, it is because they know something had already begun long before February 1st. February 1st was not the beginning, it was the conclusion. Now look at the neighborhood, the Catalina foothills. This is not an anonymous place. It is structured, quiet, observed. Residents notice unfamiliar movement. They remember faces. They question things that don't belong. Which creates a problem, a serious problem, for anyone trying to operate inside it, unless they have a reason to be there. Investigators focused on two specific elements that kept surfacing: a nearby rental property and construction activity in the same area. Individually, both have innocent explanations. But what they share is something investigators recognized immediately. Cover, not concealment, legitimacy, the ability to exist in that space without being questioned. A rental gives you a reason to be in the neighborhood. Construction gives you a reason to move around at different hours. Vehicles coming and going. People present at times they shouldn't be. And no one looks twice. That is how someone operates in a place like the Catalina foothills without drawing attention. That is how this was prepared. The family had been cleared early in the investigation, confirmed through interviews, evidence review, and forensic comparison, including DNA. But DNA also revealed something else, something that took time to fully process. The samples recovered from the scene were not clean. They were mixed, multiple contributors. And separating mixed DNA profiles is not fast. It requires time, software, reconstruction techniques that are still evolving in some cases. But what investigators knew was this: every person whose DNA appears in that controlled environment must have a reason to be there. And if that reason cannot be explained, it becomes evidence. Investigators returned to the Catalina foothills neighborhood for a second round of questioning. And residents noticed something different this time. They weren't asking broad questions. They weren't asking, "Did you see anything unusual?" They were asking for names, specific names. Who was here? Who worked here? Who had access to this area? That level of specificity tells you one thing: investigators were no longer trying to understand what happened. They were trying to identify who had the ability to make it happen. And ability is not random. It is built through access, through familiarity, through time spent in a place until you know it well enough to move through it without being noticed. Cell tower data was building its own picture. Every phone that connected to nearby towers during the relevant time window became part of a larger data set, and what emerged from that data was not just presence. It was pattern, devices appearing on January 11th, the same devices appearing again on January 24th. The same devices present on the night of February 1st. Coincidence does not repeat that consistently, and then, during the critical window between 1:47 and 2:28, those devices went dark. Not a lost signal, not a dead battery, an interruption, a deliberate interruption. Phones do not vanish from networks without reason. They are turned off. Intentionally, at a moment when someone needed them to stop recording where they were. And then the movement. Devices that had been present near Nancy's home moving outward after that window closed. Not randomly, in a direction, away from the residential core, away from the lights, toward the desert. Search teams followed that data into the desert east of Tucson. This was not a blind search. It was calculated, built on cell tower movement, geographic analysis, and the kind of data-driven work that doesn't make headlines but breaks cases. Ground-penetrating radar swept new sectors. Drones scanned for surface irregularities. Cadaver dogs moved in careful overlapping patterns. And then one of the dogs stopped, sat down, stared at a patch of disturbed earth. A second dog was brought in, independently, without knowing where the first had alerted. Same coordinates. Investigators began digging. What they found changed the emotional weight of this case forever. Because until that moment, the investigation had been largely digital, timestamps and data logs and GPS coordinates. Now there was something physical, something that had been inside Nancy Guthrie's body. Her pacemaker, buried in the desert, miles from her home, damaged, but with its serial number intact. The device that went silent at 2:28 a.m. Found in the dirt, in the dark, in the middle of nowhere. Removing a pacemaker is not incidental. It is not something that happens by accident. It is not something that happens in panic. It requires force. It requires intention. And when medical experts explained what it means, physically, to remove that device from a living person, investigators understood immediately what they were dealing with. Once that device is removed, its recording stops. The rhythm data goes dark. The movement logs disappear. The distress signals end. Someone knew that. Someone removed it because they knew that. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a moment of rage that spiraled. This was calculation. This was someone who understood that the device inside Nancy Guthrie's chest was recording everything, and decided to silence it. Now, the motive. Nancy Guthrie had reportedly begun asking questions about her finances in the weeks before she disappeared. Small transfers that didn't add up. Changes she didn't authorize. Numbers that didn't match what she expected. Enough to call her attorney. That meeting was scheduled for February 3rd. 48 hours after she vanished. The purpose of that meeting? To review documents tied to financial authority. Documents that would have shifted control. Documents that, if signed, would have changed everything for the people who stood to benefit from the current arrangement. She never made it to that meeting. And the person who drove her home on the night of February 1st knew exactly when that meeting was scheduled. Nancy's daughter Savannah has remained measured throughout this investigation. She has not accused, she has not speculated publicly, but her words have shifted, quietly, deliberately, in a way that tells you everything about where the family stands. She no longer says, "I hope she comes home." She says, "My mother deserves the full truth." Those are not the words of someone waiting for a miracle. Those are the words of a daughter who has started demanding accountability, who has decided that whatever comfort she might find in hope is less important than the justice her mother deserves. Grand jury proceedings have begun. Forensic experts have presented pacemaker data. Digital analysts have laid out cell tower maps showing movement, pattern, interruption, direction. Audio specialists have testified about what they enhanced and isolated from electronic recordings inside that home. Prosecutors are reportedly evaluating charges tied to obstruction, evidence tampering, and depending on what is ultimately confirmed in the desert terrain still being searched, something far more serious. But one charge, the one that changes everything, the one that brings the full weight of the law down on whoever did this. That charge still depends on one answer. Where is Nancy? Because her pacemaker was found. Her medication was left behind deliberately. Blood was on her porch. But Nancy herself has not been found. And that is the most painful reality at the center of everything. That is what her family carries every single morning. That is what Savannah means when she says the full truth. Because the truth is not just what happened. It is where her mother is. If you are watching this, there is something you need to hear. This case will not be solved by investigators alone. It never is. Cases like this are solved through information that comes from people who saw something and didn't know it mattered. Someone who drove past a desert road on the night of February 1st and saw headlights where there shouldn't have been. Someone who noticed an unfamiliar vehicle in the Catalina foothills neighborhood in January. Someone who sold a prepaid phone to a man they remember now. FBI tip line 1-800-CALL-FBI online, tips.fbi.gov. The reward is now $1.1 million. $1 million from the family, $100,000 from the FBI. And it can be claimed completely anonymously. You do not need to be certain. You do not need to have proof. You just need to make the call. Because in cases like this, one detail changes everything. Nancy Guthrie is not a headline. She is a mother, a grandmother, a woman who went to church on Sundays and came home to quiet evenings and had a meeting scheduled with her attorney that she never got to attend. She is a person whose pacemaker was buried in the desert while her family was on television asking for help. She deserves better than that. Her family deserves better than that. And the people responsible for what happened in those 41 minutes, between 1:47 and 2:28 on the morning of February 1st, will not outrun this case forever. Digital evidence does not forget. Cell towers log every connection. Grand juries hear every piece of testimony. And people who carry the weight of what was done that night eventually break. The silence cracked once. It will crack again. And when it does, it won't happen slowly. It will happen all at once. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. This case is not over. It is not cold. It is moving. And the people working it are closer than they have ever been. Find her.